So we finished up the first part of chapter 12. We came off chapter 11 talking about what we often say, the hall of faith, the great people of faith, the examples of their faith that they exhibited. And then going into chapter 12, he starts off, talking about running the race, laying aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and we discuss the correlation and the examples of what that might be. But we're going to start this morning in verse 12, where it says there, "Therefore strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed." This is brought from Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 3, but he has just finished talking about how the Lord has chastised us, or the Lord chastises us in the same way that our own fathers did, and how much more do we respect them. And he says there, "Therefore strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees." What does this mean? What's the example here? What's it trying to point out? Yeah. Yeah. And why might one become weary or worn out? Okay. The battle of life that we are constantly fighting can bring us down. I don't think that there's anyone that probably hasn't, went through this at some point, whether it be just life itself or fighting sin and temptation. But it can be a wearisome battle. And he says here, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. I've always, maybe you've heard this before. I don't think this is exclusive to me, but when you're running, and you're out of breath, and somebody sees you and you're kind of bent over, what do they always tell you? Whether they know anything about running, what do they tell you? Maybe that's a weird way to word it. What do they tell you to do with your hands? Put them above your head. In other words, whether they know why that works or not, they tell you to put them above their head. Supposedly, I guess it helps you breathe better, opens up your lungs. Do what? It doesn't work, yeah. No, I know. It always makes me more tired lifting my hands. I'm like, well, no, this time I need to put my hands below my head. But we understand that concept. It's supposed to help you kind of get your breath so that you can get back to running or whatever it may be. And so this idea of these hands hanging, below the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, what happens to muscles if they're not used? Okay. You've seen people that have either been paralyzed or have some type of ailment in which they are in a wheelchair, or they're unable to use their legs, and you see their muscles deteriorate, and to where if the occasion, even someone that goes through rehab or something, to where they haven't stood for a long time, they've been bedridden, and they stand up and they fall down because those muscles haven't been used for a long time. And I don't know if atrophy is the right word. I feel like that I've heard that before, but it's something to where your muscles, aren't performing like they should. And oftentimes it takes years to get that feeling back, to relearn those muscles how to work properly. And sometimes it may never happen if they're too far gone, but you understand that concept. If a muscle isn't used, it will deteriorate and it will fall away. In the context of what we're talking about, especially in Hebrews chapter 12 and throughout Hebrews, but these ones that are being persecuted, he is telling them that you have to keep up the fight. If you give up, it's going to cause you problems. You are going to almost forget how to fight. And he says there, and make straight paths for your feet so that the lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. In other words, don't make it to where they're unable to walk at all. Make it to where they can be healed. In other words, fix these issues as you see them. Does anybody have anything on that? Yeah.
Just real quick, I know it's chasing a rabbit a little bit, but That was one of the things that made Jesus's and the apostles' miracles of healing so profound. That a man who's lame from birth, which you would expect to have virtually no muscles that he needed at all, none at all. He not only walks, he leaps, or he gets up and he walks, and he picks up his bed and he takes it with him. To think, oh, well, good, he can walk again. But we're talking about muscle development and no atrophy, and to be completely restored, not just to be able to walk, but to be able to do all these things is amazing. And I know that this comes after that. So it seems to me they kind of tie the two together.
Yeah, that's a good point. I always picture that one that was at the temple's gate. Everyone knew that he was lame. I mean, it was clear. He had been begging for quite some time, and when Peter and John healed him, he was telling everybody. He didn't really have to tell everybody. They knew. They said, "Isn't this the man that laid at the temple gate?" But it was obvious. But yeah, that's a good point.
In the context of chasing persecution being how God is chastening them, it's if you just play the victim and drew your head down and just woe is me, you're gonna get destroyed. You're gonna get waylaid. It's not gonna. This is meant to test your faith and strengthen you. He's just said, but if you're not willing to meet it that way and you're just down in the dumps about it, I mean, I think what always comes to my mind when studying this chapter is Paul's thorn in the flesh, because he was kind of like, I can't handle this, and then God said, listen, my grace is sufficient for you, and that's when he strengthened up his hands and his feeble knees, and he grew because of that. He's telling them this is hard, it's painful, but it's going to make you much better, but not if you just kind of droop around and hang your head. You've got to get up. It's like, trying to wear flip-flops when you run a marathon or something. You're going to twist your ankle. Something's going to happen.
Yeah.
You've got to, equip yourself and prepare your mind and get to it.
Yeah, and I think it's, I don't know if I would say, yeah, Scott.
And we're physical and spiritual. We're talking about physical tiredness, bent over, and all that. And then the battles that are fought there. But, nowadays it's more of a mental and spiritual battle where you're mentally worn out from persecution or turmoil or whatever. You buffet your body by physically working out. You buffet your brain and your spiritual life and your mental life by diving back into the Word.
Yeah. Yeah, and I certainly think that there are some spiritual battles that can cause you physically to be down in the same way. I think we probably all fought some of those. And I think that it's, I wouldn't say funny, I think it's kind of sad. But I think it's interesting how obvious it is for us as humans to prepare for certain things that we are going to go into, whatever it may be, whether it's school or work or a run or a jog or working out, and we kind of research it and we do the development and we figure out what we need to do, what we need to eat, how we need to exercise, and we do all of those things. But yet somehow our spiritual life kind of falls on the wayside, and the preparation that comes with that kind of goes on the back burner. We don't necessarily prepare as much because we have this expectation we know enough, and I think that it does us a great disservice to the power when we don't let it work in our lives. And I think it's important that we prepare in the same way that we would prepare for anything. But he goes on there and he says in verse 13, he says, and make straight paths for your feet so that what is lame may not be dislocated but rather be healed. Why is it important that the paths are straight? Okay. Well, I don't necessarily think that there may not be areas on that path that are difficult to traverse, but I think that the end of that path is going to lead to heaven. Because the devil knows where we're at on that path, and it doesn't say that if you stay on this path that you're not going to be tempted. I think that path is actually going to cause you to be tested in your walk of Christianity, maybe more often. There's no way to say, but he's going to try to attack those that are walking on that path. So I don't think that it's necessarily going to be harmless. I mean, he's talking to people that are persecuted. He's not going to say, hey, if you do this, you will not be persecuted anymore, because persecution's it's a battle. But the end of that path is what's most important. It's not the path itself. It's where we're going that is what he's trying to point to. And he says that if you make your path straight, that we can have the gift of, or the grace of God that he talks about in verse 15. He says in verse 14, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And he says, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. So when it says there, pursue peace with all people and holiness, what does it mean? Who's he talking to, and why is he saying it? Larry?
I was actually going to make a comment on the straight paths.
Oh, okay.
And it ties into what you're asking about too. But these are instructions that we are instructed to do. There's a responsibility each and every one of us have to make sure our paths are straight, make sure we pursue peace with all people. All of these instructions, these are things that we do. We don't just haphazardly live the Christian life. We plan it out. We decide that we're going to serve God, and we follow His instructions, and set that as our path, make that a straight path. So it's definitely an individual responsibility for everybody, and then even a collective responsibility. If we do it all, watch out for each other.
Yeah, and I think, the path that we are on, we don't determine whether or not it's the straight path. There is a straight path that we must find through here that we must stay on. And I think it's important that there's a lot of teachings that say, whatever path you're on, it's a straight path. If it's a straight path to you, then it's the straight path that you should stay on. That's kind of the mentality, because if I tell you that your path is crooked, then I'm judgmental and I'm wrong, and that's completely unloving, and how dare I say that path isn't straight. But God tells us which path to stay on, and that path is straight, and we have to stay on it. So in the pursue peace with all people and holiness, he's talking to people who are persecuted, and he's telling you to pursue peace. Yeah.
And there's often a lot of times where you can react in a certain way that would be you'd be justified in that or whatnot. But in these opportunities, we need to use them to reflect God, to reflect the Christian character. So in those times, instead of saying what you could say justifiably or something, you try to represent God in that fashion and show who the true Christian character is. So I can't think of a good example at the moment, but
No, I agree. I think that he's talking to people who are being persecuted for the cause, and if they do not handle that persecution properly, then it's going to be pointless that they were persecuted in the first place. In other words, if they react out of anger or bitterness. And so he says pursue peace. In other words, don't retaliate. Don't get angry. I think that, we as especially Americans can get caught up many times, dangerously so, with our rights as citizens of this country. And when you hear Christians say things along the lines of, I dare them to come and take this away from me, or whatever it may be, it's a little scary, because we were not promised any rights like that in the Scripture. And, I think that a lot of times it's, other Christians are like, yeah, I'm right with you. If we have this constitutional right, if they take this, I'll shoot them as they come on my property. And, maybe it's kind of a giggle because it's not to that point yet. But the idea that Christians would fight for something that is, I guess worldly in itself is kind of sad. But the fact that we think that there are certain things that we are allowed to, there's certain things in which we'll say, oh no, that's of this world, but at certain things, Christians are allowed to retaliate. And I don't think that that's the example that we're given in the Scripture. I don't think that that's the example that Christ gave in his life. And so I think we have to be careful with that. But in this concept of persecution that we all endure, not to the point of maybe being stoned or thrown in jail, but we endure persecution. At certain levels, we all do. And hopefully you do. I think that it's a sign that you're probably doing something right, if you are. But when we endure that, our attitude towards that persecution can either significantly hurt or significantly help the cause of Christ. It's just a matter of fact. When you are put down, for example, in school, and I know most of us here are older, but in school, at a young age, high school, junior high, if you stand up for the cause of Christ and you're made fun of, your reaction to that is going to make a huge difference in whether or not you're glorified. And I think that you fast forward that to work or, as we get older, it's the same thing. Our reaction to persecution is going to make a big difference. So he goes into this and he says, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, which obviously no one wants to do, lest anyone lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this become defiled. Bitterness, to me, I guess I should say to me, I think that it is one of the most useful tactics of Satan. If he can bring bitterness in and cause it to take root, he can cripple a congregation and bring them down. If you let it take root, that bitterness, and you just let it fester and grow, and you give it water by getting more and more angry, he can take down a congregation. And I think that that's why it's so often talked about, is that bitterness is something we have to get rid of. We have to rid ourselves of it because it is so detrimental. And then he talks about any fornicator or any profane person like Esau. What's the story of Esau? Just real quickly. I mean, he says it here, but who is Esau? Who's his brother? Jacob. Who's his father? Isaac. Who's his mother? Rebecca. Okay. And what was the story? How did this happen? Esau was a very rugged man. He was an outdoorsy man. And what did he do? Comes in, he's hungry. Who was making, and he was encouraged to do this, by the way. Who was making a morsel of food? Jacob was. And what was he willing to do for this food? Okay. He sold his birthright. And I know that when I was a kid, I had no idea. Birthright, I was just like, I don't even know what that is. I didn't, the concept of what all that entailed, it was kind of lost on me. I was like, okay, birthright. What, because you hear later when it's given to him, he doesn't really get anything. It's not like he says, here are my 5,000 camels. And, he says, you're given the birthright. When he gives it to Jacob, you see later what that entailed. When Esau did this, we read this story, and I think that it's common for us to just kind of shake our heads and think, I can't believe that Esau did that. For one morsel of food, it says, for this cup of porridge or whatever it was. I can't imagine giving up anything for soup or stew at all. Even if I didn't like it, but the idea is that he would be willing to give up something this significant for a morsel of food. And it's something worldly. We may not think that way in the regards to food, but is there some type of temporary worldly pleasure that we are willing to give up something great? In other words, salvation for that, instant satisfaction? Because that instant gratification that we get from things that are of this world is exactly the same thing that Esau did when he gave up his birthright for a morsel of food. It's the same thing. So when we shake our heads at Esau, how often do we do that same thing? And I think that that's why it's brought out here is we see this story of Esau and what he gave up and how far-reaching it was. And this is nothing in comparison to heaven. Throughout the book of Hebrews, he is trying to relate the old versus the new. The high priest and what Jesus did, the old law and the new law, and how much better the new law is. And so he brings this example, Esau giving up his birthright for this morsel of food. How much more are you giving up for this temporary, gratification that you have? And so whatever it is, he says to pursue peace with all people. It's important to do that. Does anybody have anything on that? Okay, I feel like I'm talking a lot more. All right, so he goes on to verse 18, and he says, "For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched," this is a long sentence, "that may be touched and that burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure what was commanded, and if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling." Where's this brought out of? Yeah, sorry, the book. Yeah. Turn over to Exodus chapter 19, if you will. So what mountain is he? What's the mountain here? Mount Sinai. And in the context of what he is referring to, when he says, "For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched and that burned with fire, to blackness and darkness and tempest." In Exodus chapter 19, in verse 12, it says, "You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, Take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow. Whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain." So he gives these rules. And what is this on the precipice of? Important part. Okay. Moses is about to go onto the mountain and receive the law. And even Moses was afraid to go back up because he said, "God, you said we can't come up the mountain." He said, "You can come up. Bring Aaron. You can come up." He says there in verse 23, "But Moses said to the Lord, The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, Set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, Away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come through the Lord, lest he break out against them." He was very specific about this. And if you read what happened in verse 16, the thunderings, the lightnings, the smoke that engulfed Mount Sinai, you can imagine that this was a pretty daunting scene. Enough that when he came down and Moses spoke to them in Exodus chapter 20 and told them, it says in verse 18 of chapter 20, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. And they said to Moses, You speak with us, and we will hear it, but let not God speak with us, lest we die." The amount of fear that these people had and respect that they had for God was that they were fearful of their lives if he was to speak with them. So you have this unbelievable moment in the Israelites' deliverance out of Egypt, his he reminds Moses and the Israelites of what he did. I delivered you from Egypt. I brought you to this place. I'm going to give you this mountain. And you see this extraordinary event on Mount Sinai where, smoke engulfs it, the thundering. If you've ever been fearful of a really bad storm, it's multiply it by 1,000. Because this is God. And he engulfs this entire mountain, and it's where people understand exactly what is happening because it was already foretold what was going to happen. And he says, you cannot even come to the base of the mountain or you will die. So they do all of this, and he says, this isn't the mountain that you came to. It's better. So he goes on, going back to Hebrews, and he says, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly in the church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkling that speaks better things than of Abel. So, throughout Hebrews, we've seen this, and as I said before, this correlation between the old law and what is so much better that we have in the new law. And he's trying to emphasize this to the Jews, that what you had before, and Jeremiah even spoke to this, this morning, that old law, what you had before, you could not keep perfectly. And you have this new law, this new Jerusalem, this heavenly Jerusalem, to where an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven. And I think that that's a very comforting thought, that those that are part of the firstborns of Christ are registered in heaven. And he says that God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men, that Jesus, the mediator, that speaks better things than that of Abel. Why is the old law so much, why is the old law so insignificant in comparison to the new law? And I say not insignificant in that it didn't have its purpose, but yeah.
I think the main picture, especially in verses 18 through 21, that you see is the terrifying nature of God's holiness. And he'll go on to say, he's still a consuming fire. He's still the same God, and with the same wrath and the same everything. But the old law represents the holiness of God without atonement, that provides a way to be with him without just trembling all the time, because you can't be in the presence of a holy God when I've sinned. And the new law is still this magnificent, holy, pure, righteous God that can't have fellowship with sin, but I'm not in my sin. I'm before him as his child in fellowship with him. My sins are washed away. And that's a world of difference. And that, I think, is what's sad about people today. They mistake Christianity and what Christ did as if it changes who God is. But there's attraction to who God is. It's just there's fear because he's so much better than we can even imagine that I can't come close to him, but now I can. And if I change who he is, as if he's tolerant of sin now, he's okay with unholiness and unrighteousness, then I don't want that God. I want the God who is transcendent and unique and better and perfect. And in order to have him, I have to have my sins cleansed, my imperfections, my disobedience washed away, so that I can get on that straight and narrow path that he talked about before. And that's why Zion is so much better.
Yeah, I think you said it well. I don't think that I think that it's the access to which we have to God now is very different than what they had in the old law. And I think that he is trying to emphasize that God has not changed. But the abilities that we have enabled in our ability to speak to God, our access to the blood of Jesus Christ, is so much more powerful than the blood of bulls and goats that they had in the old law. And so throughout this, he emphasizes this concept that although that God hasn't changed, and I think that, and I don't know if I'll get there, but he brought it up. The last verse of this chapter, he says all of this. The last verse of this chapter, it says, "For our God is a consuming fire." In other words, don't think that just because this God that is of the Old Testament that you hear about doing these crazy, magnificent things in front of all of his people and setting these certain rules that they must do this on this day, and if they, wear their hair in this way that they're wrong, just because he may not set those rules, don't think that God is any different. Because God will still consume when needed, and he promises to at the end of this time. And so I think that, you bring up a good point. We feel, or it's often said that between the old law and the new law that God is somehow changed. God hasn't changed. He is still the same. Is that the access that we have to God and Jesus, his son, is different. And we should be so thankful for that. Because the old law, when you really, it's not just the Ten Commandments. I think that most of us here understand that it's not just the Ten Commandments. It is, I don't know any other word besides insane. It is crazy the amount of things that they had to keep, the amount of feasts, the amount of rules that they had to follow, and it had to be perfect or people were put to death. And we complain about coming to services on Sunday. It's a sad thing to see what they endured and that we can look down on them, and yet certain burdens that we have of doing our Bible lesson is somehow a burden. But I think that that's the point. A lot of Hebrews is this, what they endured, what you're enduring, this persecution. Don't let your head hang low. Keep your head up and continue on, because you have it so much better now. Yes.
What has been very memorable in my mind is that these words are for us also. We can't just look at the Hebrews or the people back then. These things are for us and for our learning, and we can be guilty of the same thing, maybe in a different way. We may just want our way in a certain thing and be guilty of not following the whole commandments of God. The New Testament is the sufficient word of God.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime we read this, we should make the correlation to ourselves, for sure. Anybody else have anything? I feel like I don't look to the right enough. I'm always looking to the left. I don't know if that's just, so I apologize. James?
Well, it's tough to kind of keep our focus on the end of it all.
Mhm.
It's really difficult, and that's why we get tired and we sag. We're not paying attention, and we get a little bit too focused on things around us, or the things that make it even wonderful to be a Christian. But those are not always the things we should focus on. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 20, Jesus, he sent out the 70 to start spreading the word, and he gave them power over things. And they came back, Lord, we even have power over the spirits. And, he says, yes, I gave you power over the spirits and the scorpions and the earth, but don't rejoice in this. Rejoice that your name is written in the book of life. That's what he was trying to focus them on. This is a part of that. This is just a byproduct. And you can even get tired just doing the will of God and not remember the focus of what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Appreciate that. I think it's important that, we remember that if our name is written or registered in heaven, it doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot be unregistered. We may have obeyed the gospel, but it doesn't mean that we can't fall away, because, we see multiple examples in the New Testament of people that have fallen away or have gone the way of the world. But I don't think that it is foreign to us because we each live our lives in this world, we have our battles, that it can be very difficult to keep our eye focused on heaven and Jesus and what he did for us. It is so easy to get distracted. So easy. And I think that we as Christians and as humans, with the abilities that God gave us in our mind, each have the ability to evaluate ourselves, and when we realize that we are doing that, to make it right. We can correct it, but we have to be able to recognize it. And it may be that someone else helps us recognize it, and we shouldn't be bitter towards them if they do. Hey, I've noticed you've been, kind of slacking off, that your hands have been hanging low and that your feeble knees. I know that may not be the phrases that they use, but come back. I'm worried about you. I noticed that you've kind of been weak, or whatever they might say. Christian shouldn't be bitter towards them. It shouldn't be angry towards them. I've always heard that if there's any type of reaction that one would have to someone that brings them back to the fold, it should be the most unabounding love and joy, because they save their soul from hell. And I think if we think in those terms of how devastating this could be if we're not corrected, if we don't come back to the straight path, then I think that we would probably do more correcting, whether it be in our own lives or in lives of those that we love, because it is devastating, and the result is going to be devastating. So he goes on here, and he says in wrapping up chapter 12, "See that you do not refuse him who speaks, for if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, how much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven?" It's kind of a lot of hymns and speaking, but what he's trying to say here, what I think he's trying to say is that, Moses, when he came, he's kind of referencing back this Mount Sinai experience. If they didn't escape those who refused him who spoke on earth, how much more can we not escape God in heaven? And the kind of the correlation between the chastising of a father on earth, how much more can you, recognize that this is God? And he says in verse 28, "Whose voice then shook on the earth, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of these things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain." It's one of those things you may have to read by yourself a few times, and it's a lot. "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace, by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear." Maybe it's not that difficult to read. Maybe I'm just having a hard time. But he says, "May serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear." The reverence and godly fear was on perfect demonstration at Mount Sinai. And he says you have a new kingdom here, and you still serve him the same way. You may not see a cloud coming down on a mountain. You may not see the thunders and lightnings and a man, Moses coming down and teaching you the commandments of the Lord. But our reverence towards God should be the same, if not more, because of what he's done, what he's promised, and what he's fulfilled. And so he says this, have reverence and godly fear. And then he says there at the end, "For God, our God, is a consuming fire." He has that power. It's not just all wonderful in the sense of he's not going to punish anyone because God is a loving God and he wouldn't do that. God is a consuming fire, and he is just. And I think that we can, a lot of people talk about the fact that God being just is a bad thing. I think that it would be more disheartening if God wasn't just. If he didn't give you what you deserved. If you had lived your life righteous and done everything that he said, and what, I changed my mind. I know that I had promised you, salvation, but I don't want to do that. That's not a just God. He says what he says, and he's going to stick to it. And I think that could give us great assurance. But it doesn't mean that, he's also not going to discipline those that are, lost or condemn them. Yeah.
I think maybe a way we should view how we approach God now is the difference between they had great reverence and fear under the Old Testament because of danger, and we have great reverence and fear under the New Testament. It rose from danger. We may obey the gospel to escape hell and all that kind of stuff, but out of a sense of appreciation and awe for who God is, it's so kind of like negative and positive, although there's still some of the same in each one. That we don't serve God and try to do everything right simply because if we are wrong, we'll be punished, because that's still the case.
Yeah.
Sin separates us from God, but we love Him that much. We respect Him that much. I mean, He's that valuable to us, where we don't serve Him flippantly. We take it seriously, and that's what Christianity should bring to us. That's what the New Testament should affect in us, not this flippant, like, who cares, it doesn't matter, we'll go to heaven anyway attitude. God doesn't want that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't glorify Him.
Well, I had a really good closing comment, but I'm out of time, so I'm just kidding. I appreciate your all your attention and your comments, and we'll do chapter 13 next